It all started on a hot summer night. Carlos, my husband, had left home early that morning to go to work. His long working hours had become the norm in recent months, leaving me alone for endless hours that night. Particularly tired and feeling the weight of loneliness, I decided going to bed early. I enjoyed the silence of the empty house, a calm that seemed to envelop me and lull me into a restful rest. I was immersed in a deep sleep when I felt a presence in the room. "Thank you for listening to me, Beatriz. Sometimes it is difficult to find someone to talk to," he finally said with a shy smile. I replied that I would always be there for him, and this innocent and honest conversation reminded me how much I longed for a connection like this. It had been a while since I had a sincere conversation with Carlos, and the loneliness I felt became even more evident. That night, after he left, I thought about how our relationship had changed. Something had awakened in me, something that I couldn't ignore. I felt that somehow that night had marked the beginning of something new and unknown. The following weeks saw Matthias and I talking more often. He became a constant presence in my life, filling the voids he left with his long hours of work. Conversations with Matthias were a breath of fresh air in my routine, an oasis of understanding and support in the midst of loneliness. We met in the living room, in the kitchen, or sometimes in my room, always talking about everything and nothing. One particular night, after one of our conversations, something changed. We were talking about his studies and future aspirations. When the conversation took a more personal turn, he about my own frustrated dreams, about how life sometimes takes us down paths that we never planned. "Aunt Beatriz, I always saw you as a strong and wise person. Never thought about following your own dreams?" he asked, looking at me with eyes full of curiosity. "Your question took me by surprise. No one had asked me that for a long time." I answered honestly, telling him about the opportunities I left behind and how life with Carlos, although comfortable, sometimes made me feel trapped. Sometimes I feel like Carlos and we live in separate worlds. His long hours of work are pushing us further and further apart. I confessed, feeling a sadness that I hadn't recognized until that moment. Matthias looked at me with a mix of understanding and sympathy. "It must be difficult, Auntie. I always saw you as a strong person, but we all need someone to support us." Your words touched my soul. It was true. I had gotten used to being the strong one who kept everything in order, forgotten how much I needed this emotional support. Matthew, with his youth and empathy, offered me unexpected comfort. The night progressed, and the conversation flowed naturally. We laughed and told stories, we shared secrets, and created a bond deeper than ever imagined. At some point, the atmosphere changed. I began to noticing things I had never noticed before. The way Matthias looked at me, the warmth of his smile, the depth of his eyes. It tried to ignore these thoughts, attributing it to the loneliness and vulnerability of the moment, but it was difficult. There was something in the way. Matthias leaned towards me. "In how your eyes met my dormant sensations inside. Neats, late, you should rest." "Aunt Beatriz, I didn't want to bother you for so long," he said, finally breaking the spell of the moment. "No, don't worry. Matthew, it did me good talking to you," I replied, sincerely grateful for your company. He got up to leave, but before reaching the door, he turned and looked at me again. "If you ever need me, I'll be here for you," he said with a firmness that surprised me. I watched him leave, feeling a mix of contradictory emotions that night. When I was alone again, I caught myself thinking about him more than I should have. Something had changed between us, something deeper, subtle, and I wasn't sure how to deal with it. The following weeks were filled with more frequent meetings with Matthias. Each time Carlos stayed late at the office, Matthias took the opportunity to come over to me. Visiting at first was just innocent conversations and emotional support, but little by little, these evening meetings began to awaken something more in me. One afternoon, after an argument with Carlos about his long working hours, felt especially vulnerable. I sent a message to Matthias, and he didn't take long. We sat in the living room talking about something to distract me from my worries. But that night, the atmosphere was different. I felt tension in the air, an energy that I couldn't ignore. As we spoke, I noticed how Matthias was looking at me with an intensity that made me shudder. His eyes didn't worthy of a Nephew looking at this aunt, but those of a man looking at a woman. This realization left me astonished and at the same time made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It tried to rationalize my feelings by telling myself it was just the loneliness speaking, but the more I thought, the more I realized that there was something real between us, a latent desire that was growing with each encounter. One night, while Matthew was picking up the book he had dropped on the floor, his hand brushed mine. It was a fleeting touch, but enough to light a spark inside me. Our eyes met, and at that moment I knew he felt it too. "Are you okay, Auntie?" he asked with a mix of concern and something deeper in his voice. I nodded slowly but didn't move my hand away. Yes, just a little. Surprise, he said without knowing how to express what he was feeling. He didn't move. The tension was palpable, and in an act of courage or madness, I slid my hand over his. His gaze became more intense. We stayed like that in silence for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, Matthias broke the, "I love you, Aunt Beatrice. That's not right." "I know," I replied, withdrawing my hand with a sigh. But inside me something had changed. I knew that these feelings would not disappear so easily. The first real contact between Matthias and I occurred on a night when the attention between us reached its peak. We had been talking as usual, but there was something different in the air. The conversation became more personal, more intimate, and it felt that we were crossing an invisible line that night. Matthias leaned over to pick up the book he had dropped on the floor, and his hand, he brushed against mine again. This time it wasn't an accident. His fingers stayed on mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. We looked into each other's eyes, and I saw in his eyes the same desire that burned inside me. "Aunt Beatrice, I don't know what's happening, but I can't ignore that." His voice said barely a whisper. My heart was beating hard as it tried to find the right words. "Me neither, Matthew. This is complicated, but we can't deny what we feel without saying anything else." He came over and hugged me. It was a warm hug full of affection and need. I clung to him, feeling his body against mine. And I knew there was no going back. The desire that I had suppressed for so long finally overflowed. We kissed first with shyness and then with unbridled passion. His mouth was soft and demanding at the same time, and I responded with the same intensity at that moment. All thoughts about morality and the consequences of our actions disappeared. There was just the two of us lost in a whirlwind of emotions. After that first kiss, we separated slightly, breathing hard. "Matthew, this is crazy," I whispered with my lips still burning from the contact. "I know, but I can't help, but I want you." Aunt Beatrice responded with a sincerity that disarmed me. Without further preamble, I let myself be carried away by the moment. We hugged again, and our kisses became more urgent, more intense. The room was filled with a palpable energy, and before I knew it, we were in my better bodies, intertwined in a dance of desire and passion. Each caress, each whisper was a new discovery. The intimacy we shared that night was beyond the simple physical contact. It was a deep emotional connection, a communion of souls that they longed to be understood and accepted. For a brief moment, the outside world ceased to exist. It was just Matthew and I, lost in our own bubble of happiness. When we finally fell asleep holding each other, it felt a peace that I hadn't experienced in years, but also deep down in my being, I knew that this moment of stolen happiness had a price. We were playing with fire, and sooner or later we would get burned. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and furtive encounters. Matthias and I found ourselves in the house when Carlos wasn't always taking care not to leave any trace. The adrenaline of the forbidden added a touch of passion that I had never experienced before. Each date was a mix of love, desire, and a constant fear of being discovered. One afternoon after one of our dates, we were lying in bed talking about what it all meant to us. There was a mix of excitement and anxiety in the air. "Actress, I don't know how much longer we can continue like this," Matthew said with a voice filled with concern. I looked at him, knowing he was right. Our clandestine relationship was unsustainable in the long term, but the idea of ending it seemed unbearable. I didn't want to lose that we had found in each other. "I know, Matthew, but I can't imagine my life without you." Now, I replied with a lump in my throat. We were silent for a moment, each one lost in their thoughts. I finally decided to propose something that had been floating around in my mind. "And if we kept it a secret, we can be discreet and not let anyone get suspicious. That way we could be together without risking everything," I suggested with the hope that he would accept. Matthew looked at me surprised. "Do you think this would work? We could really keep it a secret forever." "I don't know, but I'm willing to try if I don't want to losing you," Matthew nodded slowly, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Okay, let's try, but we have to be very careful. We can't afford to make mistakes." So we sealed our pact. We decided to continue our relationship in secret, aware of the risks, but willing to face it. For the love we felt, each furtive meeting became a precious moment, a treasure that we jealously guarded. We saw each other at the house when Carlos wasn't, in discreet hotels or anywhere we could be together without being seen. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and encounters. Stealth. Matthew and I saw each other at the house when Carlos wasn't, always careful not to leave any trace. The adrenaline of the forbidden added a touch of passion that I had never experienced before. Each meeting was a mixture of love, desire, and a constant fear of being discovered. We knew we were playing with fire, but the magnetism we felt for each other was irresistible. One day, after one of our meetings in a discreet hotel, Matthias looked at me with a seriousness that I rarely saw in him. "Beatrice, this can't go on like this forever." "What are we gonna do?" asked his voice loaded with worry and anxiety. It felt take note in my stomach. I knew who was right, but I didn't want to face reality. I was stuck between aim and the desire. It felt for Matthias and the life I had built with Carlos. I don't know Matthew, but I know I don't want you losing. We have to find a way to make this work without hurting anyone else. I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We were silent for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Matthew broke the silence. We could continue seeing each other in secret, but we have to be even more careful. We can't give ourselves up to making mistakes, Lua said with a determination that gave me strength. My story isn't over. Yet if you've watched this far, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much, and returning to the story. I nodded, knowing that this was our only option at that moment. We made our pact again, determined to continue our relationship in secret, aware of the risks, more willing to face them for the love we felt. One afternoon, while Matthias and I were together in my room, I heard the sound of the front door. Carlos had arrived earlier than work. We stayed paralyzed by fear, evident on our faces. There was no time for Matthias. If he hid in our reflex act, I pushed him into the closed the door just as Carlos entered the room. It tried hard to look natural, but my heart was out of control. Beatriz, is everything okay? Carlos with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Yes, she was just resting, I replied, trying to maintain my composure. Carlos looked at me for a second before nodding and leaving the room. I waited until the sound of his footsteps disappeared before opening the closet and letting Matthew out. He was pale and shaking, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of guilt. This is too risky. Beatriz, we have to be more careful, I said with a trembling voice. I nodded, knowing he was right. We were lucky this time, but we couldn't keep trusting in luck. We needed to be smarter, more cautious. The following days were tense. Carlos began to appear more attentive and suspicious, as if something didn't fit in his mind. Matthias and I became more cautious of avoiding any carelessness that could give us away. One night, while we were having dinner, Carlos looked at fixedly and said, Beatriz, lately, I notice you are different. Something is happening that I should know about. My heart stopped for a moment. No, Carlos. It's okay. I've just been a little stressed. That's all. I lied, trying to sound convincing. He nodded, but his look told me that he wasn't convinced. The suspicion had been planted, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to get rid of her. We had to be even more careful, more discreet. Matthew and I decided to see each other less often and be more careful. In our actions, we only met when we were absolutely sure that no one would suspect anything. The tension and the fear of being discovered added a different touch to our meetings, but the desire and love remained as strong as ever. Action. It came to a critical point when one night, after a heated argument with Carlos, he left the house furious. I took the opportunity to call Matthias and ask him to come. I needed his comfort, this closeness. However, we didn't count the fact that Carlos would return earlier that night. His surprise, using a compromising hug, and the reality of our betrayal fell on us like a stone. What is happening here? He's shouted Carlos with his face disfigured by anger. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't speak. My mind was a chaos of emotions and thoughts. I finally found the voice to say something, although I knew that anything he said would be insufficient. Carlos, I'm sorry, it's not what it seems. It tried to say, but anyway, as the words came out of my mouth, I knew they were useless. Carlos looked at us with a mixture of pain and betrayal in his eyes. It's not what it seems. So what is it? Beatriz shouted, her voice full of bitterness. The situation exploded. Carlos demanded explanations, and although we tried to justify ourselves, his damage was done. The truth came out, and the betrayal was too much for him to leave the house that same night, leaving Matthew and I to face the consequences of our actions. In the days that followed, I had to face the reality of my life falling apart. Matthew and it ride continue our relationship, but the weight of guilt and the pain of having destroyed our family were too much. We finally decided to separate. Matthew returned to his life, and I was left alone, reflecting on the mistakes made and the high price of betrayal. I will never forget those nights of passion and crazy, but I also won't forget the pain they caused. Life ran its course, and although the wounds healed over time, the scars of that betrayal remained a constant reminder of the fragility of human bonds and the devastating power of impulsive decisions. Every time I think about those, some days I feel a mixture of regret and nostalgia. I cannot change the past, but live with the consequences of my actions. And although life has given me new opportunities and experiences, I will always carry with me the lessons learned from that intense and painful experience.